Dust lay thick as flour over the main street of Dry Creek, stirred by every wagon wheel and every boot heel. The September sun baked the wood of storefronts until they seemed to sweat pitch, and a restless hush hung over the town as if something was about to break. Folks leaned on hitch rails and porch posts, hats shading their eyes, all waiting for the stage to rattle in. Before we step into this story, I'll ask you one thing, partner. If you love tales of the Wild West where shame turns to strength and love rises from dust, make sure you like this video, leave a comment about your favorite moment, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next campfire tale. Now, let's ride into Dry Creek together. The stagecoach rolled in with the clatter of iron rims and a huffing team, brakes squealing as the driver hauled back on the reins. When the door opened, a figure stepped down, a woman in a blue dress, neat but faded, her hem dusted by the long road. Rose McKenna. She carried herself with care, balancing a scuffed trunk in her hands. Her knuckles whitened, her lips pressed tight, but she held her chin high. Pride was stitched into every seam of her patched dress. The crowd leaned forward. Here was the mail-order bride Amos Cartwright had sent for, the promise of gossip fulfilled. Whispers darted like minnows through the crowd. "That's her? Cartwright's bride? Don't look like much." Then Amos himself appeared, striding down the steps of the mercantile, polished boots clicking like gun hammers. He was all starch and swagger, silver watch chain glinting, hat tipped back to show his self-importance. The man fancied himself Dry Creek's most eligible bachelor, though folks knew his land was mortgaged to the hilt. He stopped short when his eyes landed on Rose. For a breath, he said nothing. His face curdled, and the crowd, sensing blood, pressed closer. "You!" Amos sneered, voice loud enough to reach the back of the gathered throng. "They told me you were a God-fearing woman, a homemaker fit for a rancher's bed and table, and here you stand, a saloon dove, a woman who sang for whiskey men." The words struck like stones, hard and merciless. Gasps rippled, then the whispers sharpened into judgment, each tongue wagging faster than the next. A face flushed crimson, but he blustered, "Lies! I never—" Rose snapped the letter shut, her gaze locking on his. For a moment she looked every inch the queen he had tried to make a beggar. "Your words, Amos," she said, her voice low but carrying. "You cannot deny them now." Then, before he or the crowd could spit more venom, she bent, lifted her trunk, and squared her shoulders. Without tears, without pleas, she turned and walked away. The dust swallowed her steps as the crowd parted, scandal trailing after her like wildfire. Silence clung to the street for a moment, broken only by the creak of wagon leather and the nervous cough of bystanders. Not everyone saw shame that day. At the far end of the boardwalk, leaning against a post outside the blacksmith's, stood Cashin Ridge. His hat brim shadowed his eyes, but not enough to hide the way he was watching her. Not with pity, not with scorn, but with something steadier. Cashin was a widower, a rancher whose grief had left his house hollow. He knew the look of a person standing alone against the world, and in Rose's pride, he saw more than the town ever would. As she walked out of sight, trunk balanced against her hip, Cashin straightened from his post. His boots crunched in the dust as he followed at a distance, silent as a shadow. He didn't yet know what he would say or what she would answer. He only knew this: no one should walk away from that kind of cruelty alone. And so, with the town's whispers at his back and the desert road ahead, Cashin Ridge followed Rose McKenna into the uncertain distance. Two broken lives about to strike flint against stone, sparking a fire neither had expected. Rose McKenna walked away from Dry Creek with her trunk biting into her palms and the weight of whispers clinging to her skirts. Each step carried her farther from the jeering faces, but the echoes followed. Soiled dove, saloon girl, Cartwright near fooled. They stuck to her like burrs. The main street faded behind her, its dust settling back into silence. Yet her shame marched with her, hot as the sun overhead. The road stretched ahead, nothing but sagebrush and distance, and Rose had no notion where her feet aimed. All she knew was she could not stay. Every window in town would shudder against her. Every church pew would judge her. She might as well be walking into the desert itself, for at least the desert didn't gossip. At the edge of town, where the hard-packed road gave way to wild land, the steady beat of hooves caught her ear. She stiffened, gripping her trunk tighter, ready for more cruelty. Another man come to jeer, or worse. The sound grew until a tall bay horse appeared, and on its back sat Cashin Ridge. He was a broad-shouldered figure, hat low, eyes shadowed, reins loose in his hands. He didn't loom or swagger. He simply sat his saddle as if born to it, his presence as quiet as the evening tide. Rose froze in the road, her pulse quickening. Cashin reined in a few yards away, saying nothing at first. Dust curled around his boots as the horse pawed at the ground. When he spoke, his voice was low and steady, more like a statement than an offer. "You got someplace to go?" Rose swallowed. Her pride rose first, the instinct to snap back, to prove she needed nothing. But the truth was plain. She had nowhere, and he likely saw it written in the slump of her shoulders. She steadied her voice. "I'll find my way." Cashin studied her for a long moment, then nudged his horse closer. His gaze wasn't hungry like other men she had known, nor mocking like the townsfolk. It was measuring, cautious, like a man appraising the sky for signs of a storm. "My place is 2 miles yonder," he said. "Got a roof. Got food." Rose's grip on her trunk tightened. "And the price?" The corners of Cashin's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, not quite a frown. "No price, just shelter. You'll take it or you won't." Makes horse flesh, thick in her lungs. But he didn't turn or touch beyond what was needed. The ride was quiet. Open land rolled out around them, stretching wide and lonely. Grass bowed beneath the wind, and the sky stretched endless, pale as bone. Rose felt small against it all, yet oddly steadied by the silence. Cashin didn't fill it with needless words. He let the hoofbeats speak. At last the ranch came into view, a stout house with weathered boards, a barn leaning into the wind, and fences tracing lines across the pasture. It was sturdy, but sorrow clung to it like ivy. An untouched cradle sat in the shadow of the porch, half hidden by a wool blanket, stiff with dust. A sewing basket lay near the window, thread spools dulled with time. Rose's throat tightened. This was not just a man's house. It was a tomb of memory. Cashin dismounted, untied her trunk, and carried it inside without comment. He set it in a spare room, its window curtained with faded gingham. "You can stay here," he said simply, and left her to settle. That evening, Rose sat at his table. The meal was plain, beans, bread, and coffee, but it filled the hollow ache in her stomach. They ate in silence, the scrape of forks loud in the stillness. Rose was acutely aware of him across from her, every move deliberate, every glance brief. He did not pry, did not question. She, in turn, said little, her pride still bristling. Yet beneath the silence, tension stretched like a taut rope, not hostile, not yet tender, but heavy with unspoken things. Rose felt both safe and unsettled, a strange combination that pricked her skin. For the first time since her humiliation in town, no one called her names, no one laughed. For the first time, she sat in peace, though she did not know what peace would cost. She lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of the spare room. The wind whispered through the cracks, carrying scents of sage and dust. What did this quiet cowboy want from her? She could not yet answer. All she knew was this: Cashin Ridge was not like the others. He watched her not as a prize, nor as a shame, but as if she were something unbroken, waiting to be seen. And that unsettled her most of all. Life at Cashin Ridge's ranch began not with words, but with silence. Rose McKenna, prideful even in her shame, refused to sit idle in another man's home. The very next morning she rose before dawn, cinching her dress with brisk hands, and found her way into the kitchen. She stoked the fire, cooked a pan of eggs, and baked biscuits from what little flour she found in the tin. When Cashin came in from tending the horses, he paused in the doorway. His hat dripped with dew, his shirt darkened at the shoulders from labor. He didn't speak, only took in the sight of her moving through the kitchen as if she had always belonged there. "I'll earn my keep," she said flatly, not looking up from the skillet. Cashin gave a single nod. That was all. No argument, no false gallantry, just quiet agreement. So it went. She patched torn shirts, mended gloves stiff with wear, swept the floorboards till they gleamed. Out in the yard she fed the chickens, scattering grain with the same delicate hands that once had held a stage singer's fan. Cashin never told her what to do, never pressed her with orders. He only watched from a distance, the faintest flicker of approval in the curve of his brow. Their silence was not awkward but fragile, like a glass bridge stretched over a canyon. Step too heavy, and it would shatter. And yet, within that silence, small habits took root. Each morning, Cashin set a second coffee cup on the table. He did not pour it. He did not even glance her way. He simply placed it there, wordless but deliberate, beside his own. At first Rose ignored it, her lips tight with mistrust. But on the third morning, her hand hesitated. On the fourth, she poured the coffee herself. By the fifth, it was habit, her cup waiting, his cup full, steam curling between them. It was the beginning of trust, not spoken aloud but built in ritual, as steady as the sunrise. Days blurred into a rhythm. He worked the fences, rode the pastures, tended the cattle. She cooked, cleaned, stitched, hummed to herself while her hands were busy. They spoke little, but their silences grew softer, less brittle. A fragile kind of companionship settled over the ranch, like dust that never quite lifts. Then came the storm. It rolled in one afternoon without warning, black clouds shouldering across the horizon, winds bending the grasses flat. Airs she had once been forced to sing for coins tossed on sticky floors. This was older, gentler, sung from the marrow. Her voice trembled but did not break, weaving a melody of loss and memory. Cashin stood in the doorway of the parlor, rain dripping from his hat brim. He stopped short at the sound. He had braced himself for silence, for fear, for perhaps even sobs. But not this. Her voice curled into the corners of the room like smoke, carrying something raw, sorrow that had no stage, no audience, only truth. When at last the thunder eased, Rose fell quiet, embarrassed to have revealed so much. She glanced up and found Cashin watching. His gaze was steady, not prying but struck, as though he'd glimpsed a part of her she hadn't meant to share. "You sing different than they say," he murmured. Her throat tightened. "That wasn't for them. It was for my brother." The words tumbled out before she could catch them. Perhaps it was the storm that loosened her tongue, perhaps the silence they had lived in together, but suddenly she was speaking, truly speaking, for the first time since she stepped off the stagecoach. "He was frail from birth," she said softly, folding her hands. "No doctor could fix him. I nursed him day and night, but," her voice faltered, "he slipped away before he ever had the chance to grow. I used to sing to him, every night, just to make the darkness less cruel." Her eyes glistened in the firelight. "It didn't save him. Nothing could. But singing was all I had to give." Cashin's jaw tightened. He took off his hat, held it against his chest. For a long moment, he said nothing, as if weighing whether his silence would wound or heal. At last he spoke, his voice rough, low. "My wife died bringing life into this world." He looked past her, into the flames. "Child went with her. That cradle on the porch." He paused, swallowed. "Never rocked once. The house has been quiet ever since Rose's breath caught." His sorrow matched hers, not the same shape but the same weight. Two lives broken in different ways, both marked by loss they could not mend. They sat by the fire as the storm rumbled off into the hills, words falling between them like stones into water. Not many, not enough to explain all that hurt, but enough to show that in their silence, question without speaking it. Rose did not draw back. The fire painted his face in amber, softened the scar of grief etched at the corners of his mouth. Her breath caught, and in that fragile moment the silence swelled between them. No longer brittle, no longer heavy, but warm, like earth after rain. Their kiss came then. Hesitant, brief, yet fierce with unspoken promise. It was not the end of longing, but the beginning. A spark struck in the ashes, small but alive, ready to burn if tended. When they drew apart, Rose lowered her gaze, her cheeks flushed. Cashin stepped back, giving her space, but the air between them was forever changed. Silence remained, but now it was thick with possibility, with the tender ache of something just begun. That night when Rose lay in the spare room, the storm's echoes long faded, she touched her lips with trembling fingers. She had thought herself ruined, cast aside, unwanted. But in the quiet of Cashin's ranch, with his steady hand and broken heart, she had found something she did not expect. Not forgiveness, not yet love, but the first stirring of both.
Weeks passed, and a rhythm grew at Cashin Ridge's ranch. Rose found herself breathing easier, though the world beyond the fence line still felt hostile. When Cashin announced he was heading to Dry Creek for market day, Rose hesitated. The thought of facing those same eyes, those same whispers, churned her stomach. But pride rose in her chest. She would not hide like a ghost. If she was to carve out a life worth living, she must walk through fire again. So she climbed into the wagon beside him, her chin lifted though her hands trembled in her lap. Cashin only glanced at her once, a silent nod of respect. He never pressed her with words, but she knew he understood the courage it cost. The road into town was quiet save for the creak of wheels and the snort of horses. But the silence between them was no longer brittle. It was steady, carrying them like a current. Dry Creek appeared over the ridge, its main street lined with wagons, horses tied along hitching posts, townsfolk bustling between shops. The moment the wagon rolled in, heads turned, whispers spread like brushfire. Rose felt them before she heard them, the prickling heat of stares on her skin. She gripped the edge of the seat, every muscle tight. When they climbed down, the air shifted. Men nudged each other, women pulled their children closer. The words traveled low but sharp. Fallen woman. Cartwright was right to turn her off. Ridge ought to know better. Rose kept her spine straight, her skirts brushing the dust, her chin set as though she could not hear. But she heard every syllable. At the mercantile, Cashin walked beside her, his stride calm, unhurried. He greeted the clerk with his usual nod, but the man's eyes darted past him to Rose, narrowing with judgment. Rose ignored it, gathering flour, sugar, and salt with practiced hands. Then came the voice. Well, I'll be damned. Ruby red. The name cracked through the store like a whip. Rose froze, her pulse hammering. Slowly, she turned. A man leaned against the counter, his smirk wide, his eyes cruel. She knew him, a drifter who had once tossed coins at her feet in the saloon, demanding songs she never wished to sing. Didn't reckon I'd see you out here, Ruby, he drawled. Thought you'd be warblin' tunes in some smoke-filled hole till your throat gave out. Each step measured, head held high. By nightfall, the whispers had doubled. The story spread fast. Cashin Ridge, widower rancher, keeping house with a saloon girl. Some refused to trade with her outright, muttering that Cashin deserved better. Others jeered openly, their eyes crawling with contempt. Cashin remained unshaken, his manner as steady as stone. He drove the wagon home with silence in his shoulders, but his jaw remained set, as if grinding every insult into dust. Back at the ranch, Rose lay awake long after the lamps were out. The ceiling loomed above her, black as judgment, the night pressing heavy on her chest. She whispered into the dark, words meant for no one. I'll ruin him if I stay. The thought clawed at her heart. Cashin was a good man. He deserved respect, not scorn. By staying, she dragged him into her shame, tethered him to her past. No matter how steady he stood, she feared he would one day bend beneath the weight of her name. Her resolve hardened, though sorrow bled through it. She must leave before she broke him too. But Cashin had other notions. A few days later, at the blacksmith's forge, a neighbor let his tongue run wild. The man, broad-shouldered and loose with whiskey, spat words loud enough for all to hear. Never thought Ridge would bed down with trash, he jeered, hammer ringing on the anvil. Man ought to keep better company than some painted whore. The blacksmith's hammer stilled. The air thickened, every ear bending toward the exchange. Cashin turned, slow and deliberate. His eyes locked on the man, cold as steel pulled from the coals. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it cut sharper than any shout. You'll mind your tongue. The neighbor snorted. Truth don't need mindin'. Cashin stepped forward, his shadow long in the glow of the forge. You say another word about her, and you'll be spitting teeth instead of talk. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. The neighbor shifted, his bravado faltering under Cashin's stare. The blacksmith cleared his throat, striking the anvil once, sharp and final. The insult withered. Cashin walked away, his boots heavy on the planks. He did not look back, did not gloat. He had spoken, and that was enough.
But even his protection could not still the voices in Rose's head. On the wagon ride home, The night before the storm broke, Rose lay awake, listening to Cashin's steady footsteps fade after he banked the fire. The ranch was quiet, only the wind pressing faintly against the shutters, and yet inside her chest a storm already raged. She had seen the looks in town, heard the words whispered just loud enough to sting. Ruby red, soiled dove, Cashin deserves better. Each day his neighbor's contempt grew sharper, and each day he bore it with that same iron stillness. But Rose could feel the weight he carried. She knew what people said, even when his jaw stayed tight and his eyes calm. She would not watch him bleed for her shame. So before dawn, when the world was still hushed and dark, she rose quietly. Her shawl lay across the chair. She pulled it around her shoulders, clutching it tight. By lamplight she found paper and ink, her hands trembling as she wrote the only truth she could manage. I go, not because I don't love you, but because I do. I won't let my past destroy your name. She folded the page, set it on the table where his coffee cup always waited, and laid her hand over it a moment. Her throat ached, but she did not let herself weep. Tears would weaken her, and she needed strength to walk away. Taking her small bundle, she stepped out into the chill. Snowflakes drifted from a leaden sky, light at first, then heavier, swirling as if the heavens conspired to cover her tracks. She walked the road toward the station, her breath rising in pale clouds, the crunch of snow beneath her boots keeping rhythm with her racing heart. At the ranch, when Cashin Ridge entered the kitchen, the second cup on the table stood empty. At first he thought nothing of it. She often rose early. But then his eye caught the folded page. He read the words once, then twice. By the third reading, his blood roared like fire. She had gone, left him with a letter that claimed love even as it cut it away. For his sake, she said, for his name, as though his name mattered more than the woman who had given him back his own breath, his own heartbeat. The chair scraped back hard enough to topple. In 2 strides he was in the barn, saddling his horse with rough hands. Snow drove hard against the roof, the wind shrieking like a banshee. But Cashin mounted without hesitation. He rode. The storm bit like knives, wind clawing enough to disappear and let him live unburdened. Yet her legs trembled with more than cold. The waiting room door slammed open. Snow gusted in with him. Cashin, half frozen, his hat rimmed with ice, his face raw from the storm. He filled the doorway like a thunderhead, breath heaving, eyes blazing. "Rose!" His voice cut through the din, rough, desperate. She turned, her heart leaping painfully against her ribs. "Cashin, you ain't leaving me!" He strode forward, boots striking the planks, each step heavy with fury and fear. "You don't get to decide I'm better off without you." "That ain't your choice to make." Her lips parted, words tangled in her throat. The whole room had gone silent, strangers gawking, their whispers prickling like nettles. Rose flushed, her shame rising like bile. "They'll never stop," she whispered. "The names, the looks, you'll drown in it because of me." "Let 'em drown!" His voice thundered, fierce and unyielding. "I don't give a damn what they say. Reputation means nothing. You hear me? Nothing." Tears blurred her vision. "But your good name, my good name don't warm my bed at night." His jaw trembled, the first crack in his iron. "It don't keep me company at the table. It don't sing to me when the storm rolls in." Rose's breath caught. Cashin reached into his coat pocket with shaking fingers. He pulled out a small band, worn silver, delicate but sturdy, the stone simple yet steady in its setting. "My mother's ring," he said hoarsely. She wore it through 30 years of storms and droughts. Said it carried a promise that didn't break. He caught her trembling hand in his rough one, his warmth searing through her cold fingers. "And now it's yours, if you'll have it. Not tomorrow, not when the town approves, now." Gasps rippled through the room. Strangers leaned forward, scandalized and spellbound. Rose's tears spilled freely, trailing hot down her frozen cheeks. She had thought leaving was sacrifice, thought love meant sparing him her shame. But here he stood, half frozen from chasing her through a blizzard, declaring in front of all the world that her scars were his pride. His hands shook as he slipped the ring onto her finger. "I love you, Rose McKenna."
For your scars, of belonging, of standing unashamed beside the man who chose her against all the world. Outside, snow raged, wild and merciless. Inside, in the circle of his arms, love burned brighter, fierce enough to melt every doubt she'd ever carried. For the first time since stepping off the stagecoach into a town that scorned her, Rose no longer felt like a fallen woman. She felt like a bride.
Spring came late to the valley that year, but when it did, it came all at once. Snowmelt fed the creeks until they laughed their way down the hills, and wildflowers pushed through the thawed earth in sudden color. Purple lupine, golden buttercups, scarlet paintbrush. The meadow by the river burned alive with blossoms. It was there, not in any church with tall steeples and polished pews, that Cashin Ridge took Rose McKenna for his wife. The vows were plain, spoken in voices untrained for ceremony, but truer for it. No priest demanded them to kneel, no choir filled the air with practiced hymns. Only a handful of friends gathered, men who had ridden storms at Cashin's side, women who had pressed bread into Rose's hands when whispers cut too sharp. Rose wore no white gown. She stood in a simple dress, her hair loose, dark waves kissed by the breeze. Tucked into the strands above her ear was a sprig of sage she had gathered herself, green and silvery, carrying the scent of earth and healing. No veil to hide behind, no mask. She had nothing left to disguise, and Cashin wanted nothing hidden. When she spoke her promise, her voice did not falter. I was lost once. You found me. Now I will never walk away. When he answered, his words came like stone laid sure. You were never lost, Rose, only waiting, and I was waiting for you. They sealed their vows with a kiss, not tender, but fierce, unashamed. Wildflowers bowed beneath the wind, and the creek sang louder, as though it too bore witness. Life at the ranch settled into new rhythms. Where silence had once lingered in the rooms, now there was music. Rose hummed while she cooked, her voice threading through the air like sunlight through cracks in barnwood. She sang soft ballads when she mended clothes, lively tunes when she swept the porch. Even the horses seemed calmer when her voice drifted across the yard. For Cashin, peace arrived slowly, like a wary animal edging close. He had carried storms inside him for too long, carried rage and loneliness like weights across his shoulders. But each evening, as he sat on the porch and listened to her sing, the weights slid loose. He would lean back in his chair, boots crossed, pipe idle in his hand, and let her voice fill him until, for the first time in years, his chest felt light.
Winter cough. Slowly, the tide shifted. Rose and Cashin no longer lived for gossip. They lived for mornings when mist curled across the fields, and she brought him coffee steaming in the cup his mother once used. They lived for long days of labor side by side, mending fence, driving cattle, weeding the kitchen garden. They lived for evenings when the sun bled orange across the hills, and the only sound was her song weaving through the twilight. Years passed like that, steady and strong. Stories began to spread in the valley, passed around campfires and over poker tables. Not the cruel stories once whispered in saloons, but new ones. Stories of the saloon girl who had walked into town with nothing and carved out a home with her bare hands. Stories of the rancher who braved a blizzard to stop his bride from leaving. Neighbors told it with wonder in their voices. How Rose McKenna, once branded with shame, became Rose Ridge, the woman whose love had steadied a man as wild as the land itself. And so, in the end, they became more than man and wife. They became a tale. The final memory folks carried was always the same. Evening on the Ridge Ranch. The porch glowing in sunset's fire. Rose sitting with her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, singing softly into the wind. Cashin beside her, his broad hand covering hers, his thumb brushing her knuckles, slow as a prayer. Their shadows stretched long across the porch boards, not two broken souls anymore, but one whole story. A story of love that defied shame. A story that outlived whispers. A story that lingered like a song on the wind, fierce, tender, and enduring as the land itself.